Hello! In this video, I will analyze 5 different types of weak thesis statements and offer solutions for how to improve them. The first type of weak thesis statement that we will look at is the thesis that makes no claim. For example, this paper analyzes the similarities and differences between the original RoboCop and the 2014 remake of RoboCop. This sentence only describes what the paper will do. It doesn't make a claim about the films themselves. A more effective thesis statement would make a claim about the significance of a specific similarity or difference between the two films. For example, the handheld camera work in the 2014 remake of RoboCop reveals a tendency to value cyborg lives over human lives, which is a marked move away from the conservative cinematography and ideology of the original film. Yes, this sentence is much longer, but it makes an original claim about the two films, the tendency to value cyborg lives over human lives, and it bases that claim on specific evidence, the handheld camera work and cinematography. To ensure that your thesis statement makes a claim, try to craft a specific statement about how the objects under analysis work rather than describing what you will do in your paper. The second type of weak thesis statement is the thesis that only states the obvious. This often happens when thesis statements simply restate the author's main ideas. For example, the claim that this paper reveals Rodriguez's advocacy for a culturally constructed American identity only restates what your reader could glean from reading Rodriguez's article. Because analytical writing makes the implicit explicit, one great remedy for fixing obvious thesis statements is to compare what an author says with how the author says it. An obvious thesis statement will tend to simply repeat what the author says, but a strong thesis might analyze how an author says something and then see to what extent that method of saying something supports or subverts the author's main claims. Here's an example of a strong analytical thesis that's not immediately obvious to your reader. Although Johnson seems to advocate for immediate racial diversity at American universities, his unwillingness to use the present tense implies that this may not be feasible until some unidentified and potentially unattainable future moment. This thesis statement finds a provocative conflict between what Johnson says, immediate racial diversity, and how he says it, his use of verb tenses. Some of the best analytical work does this kind of detective work to uncover non-obvious conflicts between what a text says and how it says it. The third type of weak thesis statement is the thesis that only restates conventional wisdom. For example, Johnson's tone reveals that race is a controversial issue in American universities. It's already obvious to your readers that race is controversial in the U.S., so this claim doesn't do any useful work. To improve a thesis that states conventional knowledge, you might try to complicate that conventional wisdom. For example, although race seems to be controversial in higher education, Johnson's changing tones imply that the racial debate is not nearly as heated as the discussion about sexuality on U.S. campuses. This sentence takes the obvious conventional wisdom, race is controversial, and turns it on its head with the support of specific details, his changing tones. So, if you find that your thesis seems to restate existing knowledge, you should return to your textual object and, using tools like Notice and Focus and the method, see if, in some interesting way, your object complicates that conventional wisdom. The fourth type of weak thesis statement is the thesis that states your personal convictions. In analytical papers, thesis statements should always demonstrate your original ideas, but they should never declare your personal beliefs. This means that you need to be able to distinguish between your ideas and your opinions. Look at this thesis statement. President Obama's plan to confront ISIS is ridiculous and certain to fail. This is clearly an opinion. How do we know? 2 clues. First, it seems to be passing judgment on Obama's plan, rather than analyzing how it works. You'll remember that the judgment reflex is one of the unproductive habits of mind that we discussed earlier this semester. Second, this thesis doesn't identify any details in the text that will support this claim, which makes it appear to be a generalized emotional reaction. Now, look at this thesis statement. In his speech last week, President Obama's bellicose rhetoric revealed the White House's tendency to rush into military intervention. This thesis conveys an analyst's ideas, not an opinion. How do we know? Because the focus is on how the text works, not on the reader's response to the text. Also, it declares which details from the text it will analyze. The bellicose rhetoric. So, the primary remedy for eliminating personal convictions from your thesis statements is to suspend your judgment reflex so that you can focus on uncovering how the text works. And second, it will be easier to suspend your own judgment if you base your claim on the analysis of specific details rather than on a gut reaction. The final type of weak thesis statement is the kind that is too broad. For example, the language that both authors deploy reveals some modest similarities and some major differences in their outlook. This thesis statement leaves the reader with a lot of questions. What kind of language specifically? Is it the verb choice, or the sentence structure, or perhaps their tone? Also, what kind of similarities and differences are we talking about? And outlook on what? A thesis statement that responds to some of these questions might look something more like this. Although both authors use short sentences to create a controversial tone, Smith's repeated use of negative words reveals his combative outlook on racial diversity in higher education. This thesis statement adds specificity by describing the exact details that will be analyzed, tone and negative words, and by explaining what kind of outlook, a combative one. To ensure that your thesis statement is not too broad, provide enough specificity for both the details you will analyze and their implications. This level of precision will also function as a kind of hook that provokes your readers and encourages them to read on. To review, the 5 types of weak thesis statements are these: the thesis that makes no claim, that states the obvious, that repeats conventional wisdom, that reveals your personal convictions, and that is too broad. Often, these 5 types of weak thesis statements will overlap with each other. So it's no surprise then that their solutions usually overlap too. To craft a strong thesis statement, you'll want to avoid your own judgments, make a specific claim about something in the text that's not immediately obvious to your reader. Thesis statements are an opportunity to bring ideas to the table, and that process of generating and refining your ideas should be, to a certain extent, fun. So good luck and have fun crafting your future thesis statements.